History teaches Americans that some wars reshape the world quietly, while others detonate like thunder. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 was supposed to be a footnote, a brief colonial clash on the far edge of Asia. Instead, it became a shockwave. In our real timeline, Japan's victory stunned Europe, cracked Russian confidence, and ignited revolutions that would eventually consume the Tsars. But now imagine something far more dangerous. Imagine Russia winning. Not narrowly. Not accidentally. But decisively. In this alternate timeline, Russia does what every Western power expected it to do. It crushes Japan. The Baltic Fleet survives its journey. Port Arthur holds. The Japanese Navy is shattered. And the myth that a modern Asian power could defeat a European empire dies before it's ever born. This single change doesn't just rewrite Asian history. It reshapes the entire 20th century. No humiliation of Russia. No emboldened Japan racing toward empire. No early cracks in the Tsarist regime. No proof that Western empires are vulnerable. And most importantly, no guarantee that the revolutions, alliances, and wars Americans know ever happen the same way again. Because when Russia wins, something terrifying happens. The old empires don't fall when they are supposed to. In this world, the United States wakes up to a very different century, one where authoritarian empires adapt instead of collapse, where Asia never gets a warning shot against Western dominance, and where World War I may not be the beginning of the end, but the beginning of something far worse. This is not a story about Japan losing a war. This is the story of what happens when history fails to correct itself. And it begins in the frozen harbors of Port Arthur. In our real timeline, Russia entered the Russo-Japanese War arrogant, overstretched, and unprepared. Its leadership underestimated Japan, its logistics collapsed across Siberia, and its navy sailed halfway around the world only to be annihilated at Tsushima. Defeat seemed inevitable. But inevitability is a luxury of hindsight. Russia had advantages that history tends to forget. Sheer manpower. Industrial depth. European military doctrine. And above all, time. If Russia could stabilize its supply lines, coordinate its fleets, and avoid catastrophic command errors, victory was entirely possible. In this alternate timeline, those errors never happen. The Trans-Siberian Railway, instead of bottlenecking endlessly, is prioritized years earlier. Supplies move faster. Reinforcements arrive sooner. Russian generals, sobered by intelligence reports, abandoned their racist assumptions about Japanese inferiority. Most importantly, Tsar Nicholas II listens. Naval reforms pushed through in desperation modernize gunnery and fleet coordination just enough. The Baltic Fleet, reinforced and reorganized, avoids disaster en route to the Pacific. And when it arrives, it doesn't sail blindly into annihilation. Japan, meanwhile, faces its own limits. Its economy is strained. Its manpower pool is shallow. Every ship lost hurts more than it hurts Russia. Every month the war drags on pushes Japan closer to collapse. In this timeline, the war drags on, and that changes everything. The longer Russia survives, the weaker Japan becomes. And when the decisive battles finally come, they don't end in Japanese glory, they end in exhaustion, stalemate, and then defeat. The world is about to learn a brutal lesson: modernization alone doesn't win wars. Scale still matters. The turning point comes not at Tsushima, but earlier, and differently. Instead of a catastrophic Russian naval defeat, the decisive engagement becomes a grinding series of clashes in the Yellow Sea. Russian ships take damage, but they don't break. Japanese admirals, expecting a final annihilation, find themselves trapped in attritional warfare. Coal runs low. Ammunition dwindles. Crews are exhausted. Then comes the moment history pivots. A Russian maneuver, cautious, conservative, unglamorous, cuts off Japanese supply routes. It's not a brilliant victory. It's worse. It's slow strangulation. Japan's navy retreats. Port Arthur does not fall. Instead, Japanese forces bleed themselves dry attempting to force a decision that never comes. By the time peace negotiations begin, Japan is bankrupt, overstretched, and politically fractured. Russia, battered but intact, claims victory. No heroic underdog story. No global shock. No myth of Japanese invincibility. Just a simple message delivered to the world. European empires still ruled. In real history, Russia's defeat triggered the 1905 revolution, a warning shot that foreshadowed 1917. But in this timeline, that pressure valve never bursts. There is unrest. There is anger. But there is no humiliation. Victory gives the Tsar breathing room. Reforms are delayed, not forced. The secret police grow stronger. The army regains confidence. The idea that the regime is doomed never takes root. This changes everything. Revolutionary movements remain underground. Lenin stays in exile longer. Marxism in Russia becomes theory, not destiny. The Russian Empire limps forward, authoritarian and unstable, but alive. And a surviving empire is far more dangerous than a collapsing one. Japan doesn't become emboldened. It becomes bitter. Without victory, Japan gains no international respect. No Korean annexation momentum. No proof that empire is possible. Instead, Japan turns inward. Economic collapse sparks political infighting. Militarists are blamed, not empowered. There is no clear path to empire. No destiny narrative. No confidence to challenge the West. The Pacific remains quiet. For now Europe breathes a sigh of relief. The yellow peril myth evaporates. Asian powers are once again seen as limited, containable, manageable. Colonial arrogance deepens. The United States watches closely, and draws the wrong conclusion. If Japan can't win, then Asia isn't ready. If Russia survives, then empires can endure. This false confidence will echo for decades. By 1906, the world looks stable, but it's an illusion. Russia is stronger than expected. Japan is weaker than feared. Europe feels invincible. And the forces that would have shattered the old world are delayed, not destroyed. World War I is still coming. But when it does, the players will be different. The ideologies will be sharper. And the consequences will be far deadlier. By 1907, the Russian Empire is still sick, but it is not dying. In our real timeline, Russia limped into the 20th century humiliated, unstable, and quietly collapsing from within. The Russo-Japanese War exposed every weakness, corruption, incompetence, and the fragility of autocratic rule. That defeat planted the psychological seed that the Tsar could be challenged, and eventually overthrown. In this alternate timeline, that seed is never planted. Russia's victory does not transform it into a modern democracy or a fully efficient state. Instead, it creates something far more historically dangerous, a confident but unreformed autocracy. The Tsarist system survives without learning the lessons it should have learned. The bureaucracy remains bloated. The nobility remains privileged. The secret police remain ruthless. But the army believes in itself again. Officers who would have questioned the regime now see loyalty rewarded. Soldiers who might have sympathized with revolutionaries instead remember victory banners and parades. The myth that Russia is destined to lose collapses before it ever forms. This changes how Russia behaves internationally. Rather than avoiding conflict after humiliation, Russia becomes more assertive in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. Its diplomats negotiate from strength. Its generals argue that another war, fought closer to home, would be far easier than fighting Japan across the globe. And they are not wrong. By the time alliances begin hardening in Europe, Russia is not the weak link it once was. It is slower than Germany, less modern than Britain, but it is larger, angrier, and more confident. The world does not yet realize it, but the balance of power has shifted quietly eastward. The Balkans were always Europe's fault line, a region where empires overlapped, ethnic groups clashed, and history refused to stay buried. In real history, Russia supported Slavic nationalism cautiously, weakened by its defeat in Asia and fearful of overextension. In this timeline, Russia has no such fear. A victorious Russia throws its weight behind Serbia far earlier and far more aggressively. Panslavism is no longer a fringe ideology, it becomes an unofficial arm of Russian foreign policy. Russian advisors, money, and weapons flow into the Balkans years ahead of schedule. Austria-Hungary notices immediately. What had once been diplomatic tension becomes open hostility. Vienna sees Russian influence growing inside its borders, undermining its fragile multi-ethnic empire. Every Serbian nationalist victory feels like a Russian victory by proxy. Germany, watching from Berlin, recalculates. A stronger Russia means the Schlieffen Plan becomes riskier. Germany's window for a two-front war is shrinking faster than expected. Instead of delaying confrontation, German military planners begin pushing for earlier conflict, before Russia grows even stronger. The alliances harden faster. The rhetoric grows sharper. The countdown accelerates. By 1912, Europe feels like it is standing on a loaded weapon, and Russia's victory in Asia is one of the reasons the trigger feels so sensitive. When the spark finally comes, an assassination, a provocation, a diplomatic failure, the war that follows does not unfold the way Americans recognize from textbooks. Russia mobilizes faster. Not perfectly. Not smoothly. But faster than expected, with greater confidence and less hesitation. There is no internal panic about another humiliating defeat. The army believes it can fight, and that belief matters. Germany still strikes west. France still bleeds. Britain still enters. But in the east, the war becomes a grinding nightmare for Germany and Austria-Hungary much sooner. Russian offensives are larger, better coordinated, and politically supported at home. There is no early Russian collapse. No sudden sense that the war is lost internally. No immediate cracks in the Tsarist regime. Instead, the Eastern Front consumes men, resources, and time at an unsustainable rate. World War I becomes longer, bloodier, and more evenly balanced, with no obvious path to quick victory. The year 1917 is sacred in real history, the moment when the old world died and the Soviet Union was born. But revolutions do not emerge from ideology alone. They emerge from humiliation, starvation, and hopelessness. In this timeline, one of those ingredients is missing. Russia is suffering, deeply. Millions die. Cities strain. The economy groans under total war. But the belief that the system is illegitimate never fully crystallizes. The army does not mutiny en masse. The police do not collapse. The Tsar is hated, but not yet discarded. Without the psychological shock of past defeat, the revolution fractures before it can unify. Lenin remains a radical intellectual without the moment history needs to elevate him. Communism, for now, fails to seize a nation. When the United States enters World War I, it enters a world where Russia is still standing, and still authoritarian. There is no idealistic narrative of fighting alongside a future democracy in the East. Instead, America finds itself aligned with an empire that looks disturbingly similar to the ones it claims to oppose. This complicates everything. American politicians struggle to frame the war morally. Wilson's vision of self-determination rings hollow when one of the Allies rules millions without representation. The war ends not with clarity, but with exhaustion. And the peace that follows is far more unstable. Without a Soviet collapse, Eastern Europe is not reshaped the same way. Borders are messier. Empires survive longer than they should. Nationalist tensions are frozen, not resolved. Germany is punished, but not decisively broken. Russia is victorious, but unreformed. The United States retreats, uneasy and unsure. The conditions for another catastrophe are quietly assembled. By the early 1920s, the world feels calm again. But it is the calm of delay, not resolution. Communism has failed once, but not disappeared. Fascism has not risen yet, but the resentment is there. Empires still dominate, but they are brittle. Russia's victory over Japan did not prevent disaster. It postponed it. And postponed disasters have a way of returning far worse. The absence of the Soviet Union does not create peace. It creates confusion. In the real 20th century, the rise of the USSR gave the world a clear ideological enemy, a defined axis of fear, and a structured global tension. Capitalism versus communism. East versus West. Freedom versus control. In this alternate timeline, none of that structure exists. Russia never collapses into Bolshevik revolution. Marxism never gains a nation powerful enough to export it by force. And because of that, the world does not organize itself around ideology, it organizes itself around power. The Russian Empire limps forward into the 1920s as a massive, authoritarian state, still ruled by elites, still suspicious of reform, and still sitting on vast resources and manpower. It is not communist, but it is also not liberal. It exists in a dangerous gray zone that Western democracies struggle to understand. Without the Soviet threat, Western nations lose their unifying fear. There is no Red Scare. No ideological crusade. Instead, each nation begins acting more selfishly, more opportunistically. Alliances weaken because there is no single enemy forcing cooperation. Germany, humiliated but not destroyed after World War I, studies Russia carefully. In real history, German elites feared Bolshevism and used that fear to justify authoritarianism. Here, that fear is replaced by something colder, resentment and envy. Russia survived war without revolution. Germany did not. That contradiction fuels extremist thinking. In Eastern Europe, newly formed states lack a communist threat to balance against Western influence. They become buffer zones, bargaining chips between empires rather than ideological battlegrounds. Their sovereignty exists on paper, not in reality. Meanwhile, revolutionary movements around the world struggle to gain momentum. Without a successful communist model, uprisings in Asia, Africa, and Latin America fail more often than they succeed. Colonial empires last longer. Exploitation deepens. Anger simmers without direction. For the United States, this world is deeply uncomfortable. America cannot frame global politics as democracy versus tyranny when its wartime ally, Russia, still rules millions without representation. American foreign policy becomes cautious, transactional, and inconsistent. Moral leadership fades. The world becomes quieter, but more unstable. There is no Cold War, but there is no peace either. Instead, rival empires maneuver, compete, and test boundaries without ideological rules to restrain them. Arms races still happen. Proxy conflicts still erupt. They are just harder to explain and easier to justify. The Soviet Union never existed, but the chaos it once contained is now spread everywhere. And in that chaos, new monsters begin to take shape. By the mid-1920s, it becomes painfully clear that survival has taught the Russian Empire the wrong lesson. In real history, collapse forced change. Defeat humiliated the Tsarist system so thoroughly that reform became unavoidable, revolution inevitable. But in this alternate world, Russia never experiences that reckoning. Victory over Japan, followed by endurance in World War I, convinces the ruling elite that the system works, not because it is just, but because it is strong enough to endure punishment. This belief hardens the empire. Rather than liberalizing, the Tsarist state doubles down on control. Political dissent is tolerated only at the margins. The secret police expand quietly, learning from wartime surveillance techniques. Universities are monitored. Labor movements are infiltrated. Nationalist minorities are suppressed more efficiently than before. Crucially, this repression is not chaotic. It is bureaucratic. The Russian Empire evolves into a modern authoritarian state without ever becoming revolutionary or ideological. It does not promise utopia. It promises order, stability, and national survival. That makes it far more acceptable to conservative elites at home, and far more difficult for foreign powers to oppose openly. Economically, Russia modernizes unevenly but steadily. Railways expand. Heavy industry grows under state supervision. Foreign capital flows in cautiously, attracted by resources but wary of politics. Unlike the Soviet model, there is no forced collectivization, no catastrophic famine engineered by ideology. The peasantry remains poor, but alive. This creates a dangerous illusion, that gradual authoritarian modernization is safer than radical change. To many observers in Europe and America, Russia looks old-fashioned but stable. A relic, perhaps, but a manageable one. That assumption will prove disastrously wrong. Because stability without reform creates pressure without release. Young officers, educated professionals, and urban workers begin to recognize the contradiction. They live in a country powerful enough to influence continents, yet rigid enough to deny them voice. Their frustration does not explode into revolution, it calcifies into resentment. Unlike 1917, there is no unifying ideology to rally behind. No Lenin. No Bolshevik party. Instead, opposition fragments into nationalist movements, reformist circles, and underground radicals with no common vision. The state survives, but trust evaporates. For the Russian military, this era is transformative. Victory culture replaces reform culture. Generals study logistics, attrition, and manpower, not civilian oversight. The army becomes the true backbone of the state, increasingly autonomous and politically influential. This militarization does not immediately threaten the world. But it quietly reshapes Russia's identity. The empire begins to see itself not as a civilizational bridge between East and West, but as a fortress civilization, destined to endure through strength alone. The tragedy is subtle but profound. Russia could have evolved. It could have reformed. Instead, it learned how to survive without changing. And history is about to test whether survival is enough. Germany emerges from the aftermath of World War I with a familiar wound but an unfamiliar diagnosis. In real history, German humiliation was explained through betrayal myths and fear of Bolshevism. Communism became the specter used to justify authoritarianism, militarization, and eventually genocide. But in this alternate world, the Soviet Union never exists. There is no red menace stalking Europe's imagination. No ideological crusade to frame Germany's collapse as a defensive necessity. Instead, Germany's rage searches for something more tangible. It finds Russia. To German nationalists, the contradiction is unbearable. Germany industrialized faster, fought harder, and innovated more, yet it lost. Russia, slower and less efficient, survived and emerged territorially intact. Not because it was superior, but because it endured. That reality offends everything German elites believe about modern power. Resentment hardens into obsession. German military thinkers rewrite the lessons of the war. They conclude that Germany did not lose because it lacked strength, but because it fought the wrong enemies, at the wrong time, with the wrong priorities. The real mistake, they argue, was allowing Russia the space to recover and consolidate. This is a subtle but crucial shift. Without Bolshevism to fear, Eastern Europe is no longer a buffer against chaos, it is a corridor to be dominated. German expansionism still emerges, but its logic changes. It is not framed as an ideological crusade against communism. It is framed as a preventive war against Russian mass and endurance. This makes German nationalism colder, more strategic, and less theatrical, at least at first. Politically, extremist movements still rise, fueled by economic pain and wounded pride. But their rhetoric emphasizes destiny, efficiency, and survival rather than racial apocalypse. Jews, minorities, and political opponents are still scapegoated, but the central narrative is not purity, it is competition. Who deserves to rule Europe, the disciplined modern state, or the bloated imperial survivor? Russia becomes the answer. German rearmament begins earlier and more quietly. There is less public spectacle, fewer dramatic purges, and more focus on logistics, mechanization, and speed. The goal is not to terrorize the population into obedience, but to prepare the nation for a decisive reckoning. Meanwhile, Western Europe misreads the signals. Britain and France assume that without communism, Germany's extremism will burn itself out. They see Russian authoritarianism as a stabilizing force, not a provocation. Diplomatic efforts focus on economic recovery, not strategic containment. The United States watches from across the Atlantic, relieved that there is no ideological enemy demanding global intervention. Isolation feels safe again. But Germany is not calming down. It is recalculating. By the late 1920s, German military doctrine quietly centers on one idea: the next war must be fast, decisive, and Eastern. Not to destroy an ideology, but to shatter an empire before it can absorb the blow. Russia, for its part, senses hostility but underestimates its intensity. Confident in size and survival, the empire assumes time is on its side. History is about to prove how dangerous that assumption can be. By the early 1930s, Eastern Europe stops being a region and becomes a question. Who controls the land between Germany and Russia? Who decides the fate of nations too small to defend themselves, yet too strategically valuable to ignore? In real history, Eastern Europe existed in the shadow of two ideological giants, Nazism and communism. But in this alternate world, ideology plays a smaller role than geography. Power, not belief, determines destiny. The states carved out after World War I, Poland, the Baltics, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, are fragile creations born from compromise rather than stability. Without the Soviet Union to counterbalance German ambition, and without Western guarantees strong enough to matter, these countries exist in a permanent state of anxiety. Russia claims to be their protector. Germany views them as obstacles. The Russian Empire approaches Eastern Europe cautiously but possessively. It offers trade agreements, military advisors, and security assurances that sound generous but carry an unspoken message: alignment is expected. Russian diplomacy frames this influence as historical responsibility, Slavic brotherhood, shared sacrifice, regional stability. In practice, it is control by proximity. Germany responds differently. Berlin does not promise protection. It promises efficiency. German economic penetration begins first: investment, infrastructure, trade dependency. Rail lines, factories, and military contracts bind Eastern Europe westward, one agreement at a time. These nations are not choosing sides. They are being absorbed. Poland becomes the focal point. To Russia, Poland is a buffer that must never fall under hostile influence. To Germany, Poland is a corridor blocking access to resources and strategic depth. Polish leaders attempt neutrality, but neutrality requires power, and Poland has little of it. Meanwhile, Western Europe hesitates. Britain and France still believe diplomacy can stabilize the continent. They see Eastern Europe as a chessboard of local disputes, not the front line of an approaching storm. Without the ideological clarity of anti-communism, there is no urgency driving intervention. The United States remains distant, convinced that Europe's balance of power will regulate itself. It won't. As German and Russian influence presses inward, Eastern European governments begin militarizing rapidly. Conscription expands. Defense budgets spike. Political freedoms shrink under the justification of national survival. Democracy weakens not because people reject it, but because fear makes it impractical. The region becomes tense, armed, and brittle. One miscalculation, one assassination, one border incident, one broken treaty, could ignite a conflict no one officially wants, but everyone is preparing for. Germany believes speed will save it. Russia believes size will protect it. Eastern Europe believes endurance is enough. All three are wrong. Because when great powers treat geography as destiny, the people who live there become expendable. And history is once again moving toward a war that no one will admit they are planning, until it begins. The 1930s begin with a lie, and most of the world accepts it. After the trauma of World War I, nations desperately want to believe that another global conflict is impossible. Treaties are signed. Conferences are held. Borders are recognized on paper. Political leaders speak the language of restraint, cooperation, and recovery. From Washington to London to Paris, the prevailing belief is simple: the worst has already happened. In this alternate timeline, that belief is even stronger. There is no communist superpower threatening revolution across borders. No ideological wildfire forcing nations to choose sides. The absence of a Soviet Union creates the impression that the world has learned its lesson. Extremism appears contained. Empires appear stable. History appears to be slowing down. But peace built on exhaustion is not peace at all. Germany, outwardly compliant with post-war restrictions, uses the decade to rebuild quietly. Industrial capacity expands under civilian justification. Military research continues behind bureaucratic language. Engineers experiment with mechanized warfare not as a tool of conquest, but as a solution to strategic inferiority. Speed will replace numbers. Coordination will replace attrition. Russia, meanwhile, mistakes survival for security. The Russian Empire views the 1930s as a period of consolidation. It expands infrastructure east and west, strengthens internal security, and suppresses dissent with increasing efficiency. Military planning assumes that any future war will resemble the last, slow, massive, and ultimately survivable through depth. That assumption is fatal. Russian leadership underestimates how profoundly warfare has changed. They believe manpower and territory will absorb any shock. They do not anticipate a war designed not to break armies gradually, but to paralyze them immediately. Eastern Europe remains trapped between these miscalculations. Treaties guarantee their independence, but guarantees without enforcement are ceremonial. When German and Russian diplomats speak of peace, smaller nations hear postponement. Defense planning becomes desperate. Leaders choose between appeasing one power or provoking the other, both options dangerous. Western Europe watches nervously but passively. Britain, scarred by the Great War, avoids commitments that might pull it back into continental conflict. France builds defenses and hopes deterrence will hold. Neither truly confronts Germany or challenges Russian influence beyond rhetoric. The United States retreats into isolation once again. Without a clear ideological threat, Americans see European tensions as old-world problems. Economic recovery becomes the priority. Intervention feels unnecessary, even irresponsible. This creates a vacuum, and vacuums never stay empty. By the late 1930s, peace exists only because no one has yet found the perfect excuse to break it. Armies are ready. Plans are drawn. Borders are tested quietly through intimidation, economic pressure, and covert action. The illusion holds, barely. And illusions, when shattered, tend to explode. Because the coming war will not be about ideology. It will not be about liberation. It will be about who controls the center of the world. And when that question is finally asked with weapons instead of words, the answer will be catastrophic. Wars do not always begin with speeches or declarations. Sometimes they begin with silence. By the late 1930s, Europe is no longer at peace, it is merely waiting. Borders are tense. Diplomats speak cautiously. Armies move under the cover of exercises and defensive preparations. Every major power understands that conflict is coming, yet no one wants to be remembered as the one who started it. In this alternate world, the first shots are not fired in defiance of treaties, but in denial of responsibility. The spark comes in Eastern Europe, as it so often does. A border incident between a German-aligned militia and a Russian-backed security force escalates beyond control. Each side blames local commanders. Each government denies intent. But troops do not withdraw. Reinforcements arrive instead. Germany acts first, but not officially. Armored units surge forward under the justification of protecting ethnic Germans and securing transit routes. There is no declaration of war, only statements about restoring order. Speed is everything. German planners understand that once Russia fully mobilizes, the advantage disappears. The goal is to create facts on the ground before diplomacy can catch up. Russia is stunned, not by the attack itself, but by its velocity. Russian forces are massive, but slow to reposition. Command structures assume days or weeks of warning. Instead, German mechanized columns penetrate deep into contested territory within hours. Communication lines fracture. Local commanders hesitate, uncertain whether they are witnessing an incident or an invasion. By the time Moscow acknowledges the reality, the narrative has already formed. Germany claims it is responding to chaos. Russia claims provocation. Neither side formally declares war, yet thousands are already dead. Eastern European states collapse under the pressure. Governments flee. Armies disintegrate or align with whichever force occupies their territory first. Neutrality proves impossible. Geography chooses sides faster than politics can. Western Europe is paralyzed. Britain and France issue condemnations, but hesitate to intervene. Without a clear declaration of war, treaty obligations feel ambiguous. Memories of 1914 haunt every decision. Leaders hope the conflict will stabilize before it spreads. It won't. Russia mobilizes fully, but the nature of the war is already wrong for it. This is not a slow grind of attrition. This is a war of disruption, targeting logistics, command, and coordination. Russian depth offers protection, but also confusion. Orders lag behind reality. Germany, meanwhile, presses its advantage relentlessly. Not because it expects an easy victory, but because it knows delay favors Russia. Every hour matters. Every bridge, rail junction, and communications hub becomes a battlefield. The world watches, uncertain whether it is witnessing a regional crisis or the opening act of something far larger. It is the latter. The war that no one declared has begun, and once unleashed, it will demand answers from every major power on earth. Eastern Europe, once a patchwork of fragile treaties and fragile states, begins to breathe uneasily. Borders drawn on paper do little to protect the nation squeezed between two great powers. Poland, Czechoslovakia, the Baltics, these states find themselves caught in a silent tug-of-war between Russia and Germany. Neither empire wants open war yet, both prefer influence, control, and leverage. But influence is not exercised quietly in a region where history never sleeps. In towns along contested borders, small incidents become daily life. A border patrol is ambushed by unknown forces. A train carrying supplies is derailed. Rumors circulate of spies posing as civilians. Each incident is minor in isolation, but collectively they create an invisible pressure that weighs on governments and populations alike. Leaders scramble to respond without provoking their powerful neighbors, but the uncertainty is corrosive. Every action could be misinterpreted, every inaction could be exploited. Polish officials convene in Warsaw, debating whether to strengthen border fortifications or appeal to Western powers for guarantees. The answer seems simple, but the reality is complicated. Britain and France issue statements of support, yet the language is intentionally vague. Neither is willing to risk its own citizens or resources for distant territories. The United States, still focused on domestic recovery from economic turmoil, watches with polite concern but offers no tangible assistance. In practice, the smaller nations are on their own. Meanwhile, Russia's shadow looms ever larger. Russian advisors arrive under the guise of training exercises. Military maneuvers are conducted along borders in full view of Western observers, justified as defensive but impossible to ignore. Locals witness columns of troops, tanks, and supplies moving steadily, creating a sense that Moscow is testing reactions rather than waiting. It is an empire sending a message: we are here, we endure, and we are watching. Germany mirrors this behavior in the West. Industrial expansion disguised as civilian infrastructure doubles as logistical preparation. Rail networks are reinforced, armored units are trained, and intelligence operations quietly expand. German planners focus on rapid deployment, preparing for a war that they hope will never arrive, yet they prepare as if it already has. In these tense years, ordinary civilians feel the unease in ways that politics cannot capture. Markets fluctuate unpredictably. Farmers worry their produce might be requisitioned. Families hear stories of mobilized troops and spy networks infiltrating their communities. Anxiety spreads faster than any official report. Fear of an unseen, impending confrontation permeates everyday life, creating an atmosphere of suspense that no one can openly admit. Diplomats in European capitals move cautiously, too. Every conversation is scrutinized, every letter intercepted or mistrusted. Miscommunication and overinterpretation become as dangerous as bullets. Leaders understand that the difference between calm and catastrophe can be measured in hours, not days. The fragile stability of the continent depends on the restraint of empires who are preparing to act decisively, when the moment is right. In the East, then, the world waits, suspended on the edge of inevitability. Tension is no longer abstract, it is tangible, almost visible in the streets, in the councils, in the nervous adjustments of armies and civilians alike. Europe has paused, but the silence is fragile. One spark, one misstep, one underestimated decision, could ignite a continent. And in that moment, patience will turn into panic, diplomacy into chaos, and fear into war. As the late 1930s progress, the silent tension in Eastern Europe begins to take on a more visible form. Armies, once stationary, begin to stir. The great powers of the continent, though still unwilling to declare war, cannot ignore the pressure building along their borders. What was once abstract anxiety now becomes steel, manpower, and strategy. Military machines awaken, and with them, the faint but unmistakable scent of impending conflict. In Russia, the empire views the rising unrest with a mixture of confidence and calculation. The army, long a pillar of autocratic survival, expands its exercises, drills, and maneuvers. Logistics, often a historical weakness, are meticulously rehearsed. Rail lines are cleared, supply depots reinforced, and communication networks tested with precision. Units previously scattered across the vast empire are rotated closer to western and southern fronts, not in overt aggression, but in a quiet, deliberate demonstration of capability. Commanders believe that showing preparedness will deter Germany from attempting bold moves, even as the threat of miscalculation grows. Germany mirrors this cautious escalation. Its generals, steeped in the lessons of World War I, approach mobilization with cold efficiency. The army is not parading in public squares but training in controlled zones where every movement is calculated for speed and impact. Mechanized divisions are drilled relentlessly, experimenting with coordination between infantry, armor, and air reconnaissance. Strategists simulate scenarios for rapid deployment across Eastern Europe, envisioning a war that, in reality, no one wants to begin, yet the planning itself creates a momentum that is impossible to halt. Germany's industrial sector quietly supports these efforts, camouflaging military expansion as economic recovery. Every bridge reinforced, every railway line repaired, every weapons factory upgraded, subtly increases the inevitability of conflict. Smaller Eastern European states feel the pressure immediately. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and the Baltics recognize that while diplomacy continues, the reality on the ground is rapidly shifting. Military budgets rise dramatically, conscription expands, and local militias are trained to respond to ambiguous threats. Civilians observe tanks moving through the countryside, hear distant artillery exercises, and notice that young men are no longer free to ignore military service. Fear becomes tangible, as citizens understand that the armies they are building may soon march beyond their borders. At the same time, Western Europe struggles with indecision. Britain and France, scarred by the Great War, attempt to reassure the smaller nations with promises of support while simultaneously advocating caution. Yet there is no appetite for immediate engagement. Their military planners watch and note the expansions, but hesitate, hoping that the slow creep of preparation will not turn into actual combat. Meanwhile, the United States remains largely uninvolved, preoccupied with economic recovery and political isolationism. Across the Atlantic, Europe's mechanical stirrings are merely headlines, not imperatives. Even as armies mobilize on paper and drill in practice, the world clings to a fragile belief in restraint. Yet there is a danger in these displays. Preparation itself accelerates the march toward war. When vast forces are trained, equipped, and poised, even a minor incident can ignite a chain reaction. The very act of readiness creates expectation. Soldiers march, supplies move, and nations brace. In doing so, they awaken the continent's latent conflicts, transforming the invisible tension of Section 21 into a palpable, looming threat. Eastern Europe has moved from anxious observation to strategic motion. The silence that once held the world in suspense is broken by the quiet rumble of gears, boots, and iron. The military machines have awakened, not yet striking, but certainly stirring. And history, patient but relentless, watches from the edge of inevitability. As armies quietly stir across Eastern Europe, the diplomatic corps scramble to maintain the illusion of control. Conferences, treaties, and backroom negotiations dominate the calendars of European capitals, yet beneath the polished surfaces of rhetoric, the foundations of diplomacy are cracking. Words are exchanged with careful precision, but gestures and implications carry far more weight than promises ever could. Every handshake is measured, every communiqué scrutinized, and every envoy shadowed by the heavy uncertainty of the moment. In Berlin, the Foreign Office prepares proposals meant to placate smaller nations while advancing German strategic objectives. Publicly, the language is moderate, emphasizing peace and cooperation. Privately, diplomats calculate influence, supply routes, and timing, ensuring that German power is poised to capitalize on any hesitation. No one wishes for open war, yet in this careful maneuvering, war edges closer because every calculated move alters the balance, making inaction increasingly impossible. Meanwhile, Moscow orchestrates its own delicate dance. Russian envoys attend international conferences, pledging support for regional stability, while simultaneously signaling that their patience is limited. Exercises and troop movements along borders are framed as defensive, yet their scale sends unmistakable messages. The empire seeks to assert dominance without breaking the fragile veneer of diplomacy, but the longer the tension endures, the more likely misinterpretation becomes inevitable. Every action has a ripple effect that no bureaucrat can fully control. Eastern European leaders are caught in the middle. They issue formal statements of neutrality, appealing to treaties and moral arguments, but neither Germany nor Russia treats these claims as binding. Economic dependencies, military aid, and cultural influence subtly coerce compliance. For smaller states, diplomacy no longer protects them, it merely delays confrontation. The illusion of agency persists, yet in reality, their fate is being shaped by powers far beyond their borders. Across the continent, Western European powers watch cautiously. Britain and France speak of restraint and negotiation, hoping that measured diplomacy will hold the balance. Yet experience from past wars has left them wary. Each nation's diplomatic team analyzes every movement, every speech, and every troop deployment, understanding that a single misstep could trigger a chain reaction. Despite this awareness, there is little consensus on how to respond. Caution, while seemingly wise, inadvertently increases the pressure on Eastern Europe to act independently, creating a vacuum that Germany and Russia quietly exploit. This slow failure of diplomacy does more than unsettle governments, it unsettles populations. Propaganda, rumors, and media speculation spread fear and uncertainty. Citizens see armies mobilizing and hear about tense conferences, yet they are told to trust in negotiations that seem increasingly ineffectual. Anxiety becomes pervasive, gnawing at the confidence that peace might hold. By the end of this period, it becomes clear that diplomacy has done what it often does: it has delayed, not prevented. Talks, treaties, and committees provide only temporary respite. Beneath the formalities, the mechanisms of power are quietly preparing to assert themselves, while the world clings to fragile assurances that have already begun to crumble. The stage is set. Military forces are prepared, populations are anxious, and diplomacy is failing, slowly, deliberately, and almost imperceptibly. Europe waits, suspended on the brink of events that no negotiation can stop. For years, Europe had been suspended in a fragile silence. Diplomacy failed slowly, armies prepared meticulously, and civilians lived under the invisible weight of tension. Yet even the longest periods of anticipation eventually find their spark. In Eastern Europe, that spark comes quietly, almost unnoticed: a border skirmish, a sabotage incident, a misjudged patrol, seemingly minor, but enough to remind the world that preparation alone cannot prevent conflict. In a small town along the Polish border, local militias clash over disputed territory. Neither side claims a formal offense. Neither side intends to escalate. And yet the incident quickly grows. Trains are halted, communications are intercepted, and reinforcements arrive within hours. Both German and Russian forces mobilize near the border under the guise of security, each move interpreted as aggression by the other side. Fear and misperception amplify every action, transforming a local scuffle into a continental warning. News travels slowly, but rumors travel faster. Newspapers report the skirmish in dramatic language, often exaggerating the scale or the intent of the involved parties. Citizens panic as stories of foreign troops advancing, supply lines cut, and artillery shells falling reach even those far from the front lines. Markets fluctuate, families prepare evacuation plans, and young men enlist or are conscripted as the sense of urgency spreads. In this moment, war has begun in the minds of the people, even if governments cling to denial. Diplomats convene emergency meetings. Envoys exchange heated communications, each side asserting that the other provoked the incident. Meetings intended to calm nerves only increase suspicion. Western powers, still hoping to mediate, issue statements that are vague, non-committal, or contradictory. Their words are interpreted as weakness by Russia and Germany alike, further emboldening both to prepare for the possibility of a larger conflict. The delicate web of international relations begins to fray visibly. Military planners take notice. Russian commanders, confident in their size and logistics, believe they can absorb any localized flare-up without consequence. German strategists, reliant on speed and maneuver, see opportunity, a chance to test enemy responses, to gauge readiness, and, if necessary, to secure advantages before full mobilization. Both sides operate with caution, yet every troop movement, every reconnaissance flight, every armored train reinforces the tension, creating a chain reaction that no one can fully control. Even minor incidents elsewhere, sabotage of rail lines in the Baltics, intercepted communications in Czechoslovakia, are magnified by perception. Europe is sensitized, hyper-alert, and ready to interpret any signal as a prelude to full-scale war. In this environment, the first sparks, though small, become incendiary. They remind all parties that preparation alone does not prevent conflict. The machinery of war is awake, and it can be ignited by even the slightest spark. Thus, the world stands at a threshold. The first sparks have flared, visible to anyone paying attention, yet small enough that denial remains possible. Suspense tightens like a drawn bow, the tension stretching across borders, armies, and populations. Diplomacy, armies, and civilians alike are caught in a delicate balance. One misstep, one misunderstanding, and the entire continent could ignite. While generals calculate troop movements and diplomats negotiate with cautious words, the people of Eastern Europe experience the conflict in ways far less orderly but far more immediate. Anxiety seeps into daily life, creating a tension that no treaty or military plan can alleviate. Ordinary citizens feel the tremors of a war that hasn't yet begun, but whose shadow stretches across every village, town, and city. In Warsaw, families whisper about possible mobilization. Young men vanish to join local militias or conscription rolls. Shops limit stock for fear of supply disruptions. Markets fluctuate unpredictably as traders react to rumors of troop movements and border skirmishes. A single headline about Russian exercises or German patrols crossing a disputed border can send waves of fear across entire neighborhoods. People learn to interpret the subtle signs of war, distant sounds of artillery drills, columns of vehicles moving along railways, and the hurried discussions of men in uniforms. Even in rural areas, far from government scrutiny, fear spreads. Farmers worry that their land may be requisitioned for military use, or that conscription will take away their sons at the worst possible moment. Communities brace themselves for displacement, understanding that geography has rendered them powerless in the face of empires. Rumors of foreign spies, saboteurs, and infiltrators permeate villages, creating suspicion among neighbors and fueling tension at the local level. Anxiety becomes contagious, spreading faster than news or orders ever could. Propaganda amplifies this uncertainty. Both Germany and Russia, while carefully avoiding open war, disseminate messaging designed to reassure their populations while subtly intimidating neighboring states. Posters, newspapers, and radio broadcasts emphasize national strength, preparedness, and the moral justification of defensive measures. Civilians in contested areas are caught in the middle, the messages are contradictory, and the underlying reality, that conflict may erupt without warning, is undeniable. People no longer wait for orders, they anticipate crisis. This uncertainty affects governance as well. Leaders of smaller states, desperate to maintain control, issue vague statements about neutrality, preparedness, and allegiance. Citizens interpret these statements as either protection or warning, and both interpretations intensify anxiety. The fragile trust between government and population strains under the invisible weight of impending conflict. Fear becomes a governing force, influencing decisions at every level. Daily life continues outwardly unchanged, markets still operate, schools remain open, and work continues, yet beneath the surface, society is gripped by tension. Families plan evacuation routes quietly, neighbors discuss rumors in hushed tones, and communities prepare makeshift defenses. The omnipresence of fear becomes the defining feature of life, creating a pervasive psychological battlefield long before armies meet. In this way, Europe teeters. While diplomats and generals maneuver carefully, civilians live the consequences of their hesitations and miscalculations. Anxiety and uncertainty are not collateral damage, they are the first visible sign that the continent is preparing itself for something it cannot yet name. The first sparks may have ignited localized conflict, but the invisible fires of fear now engulf entire populations. War, though not fully present, has already begun in the hearts and minds of ordinary people. While civilians brace themselves and armies drill along borders, The true war is being fought in shadows and whispering corridors. Europe's great powers maneuver not with open artillery or visible tanks, but through espionage, secret agreements, and subtle economic pressures. Every action is calculated, every interaction measured, yet the cumulative effect moves the continent closer to an unavoidable confrontation. In Berlin, intelligence networks expand quietly. Agents infiltrate factories, rail depots, and border towns in Eastern Europe, reporting troop movements, supply stockpiles, and political sentiment. The Reich sees value in understanding the terrain of influence before committing forces openly. Small incidents, sabotages, or miscommunications are not merely threats, they are experiments, probing weaknesses, and creating openings for future operations. Every coded telegram, every hidden observation, adds to a mental map of opportunity. Moscow mirrors this secrecy. Russian operatives work through diplomatic channels, charitable organizations, and even business ventures to monitor and influence Eastern European states. Meetings with foreign leaders are carefully recorded, private discussions interpreted for hints of loyalty or dissent. Strategic planners observe German preparations, attempting to anticipate their next moves without giving away their own capabilities. The Russian Empire operates with patience and precision, confident that size and reach provide protection, yet every covert action carries risk, and one misstep could escalate into open confrontation. Smaller nations find themselves caught in a web of subtle pressures. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and the Baltics are subject to dual influence, economic incentives, military advisors, and diplomatic ultimatums from both sides. Leaders attempt to maintain independence, yet every decision is scrutinized and exploited. Neutrality becomes a dangerous position, easily misinterpreted as weakness or alignment. In the shadows, espionage thrives, and governments struggle to discern friend from foe. Meanwhile, Western European powers continue their cautious observation. Britain and France maintain embassies, intelligence networks, and quiet pressure campaigns, hoping to mediate tensions without risking escalation. Yet their absence of decisive action allows German and Russian maneuvering to proceed largely unchallenged. The perception of Western hesitation encourages bolder covert operations in the East. Diplomacy and espionage intertwine, creating a complex game of cat and mouse, where misinterpretation can be as deadly as a battlefield decision. Even ordinary civilians sense the invisible currents. Rumors of secret agents, foreign collaborators, and sudden disappearances create unease. The psychological impact of espionage is subtle but profound. People begin to question the reliability of neighbors, local authorities, and even family members. The human element, uncertainty, suspicion, and paranoia, spreads faster than armies could ever march. In essence, war has already infiltrated everyday life, long before any open confrontation. These behind-the-scenes maneuvers shape the stage for the inevitable. Armies are trained, civilians are anxious, diplomacy is faltering, and yet it is the quiet, hidden operations that will determine the first true moves when conflict erupts. Europe teeters on a knife edge, aware of the danger but still grasping for control. Every secret deal, every spy, every coded message nudges the continent toward a moment when hesitation is no longer an option. The world waits in shadow and silence. The mechanisms of war are moving unseen, yet their consequences are already felt. The next spark may not come from artillery or a patrol, it may come from the unseen hand of power, manipulating events behind the scenes, preparing the continent for a confrontation that no one can now prevent. The continent holds its breath. Europe, so carefully poised, now teeters on the edge of irrevocable change. Armies stand ready along borders, though no shots have yet been fired. Diplomats continue their fragile negotiations, though every word, every gesture, is shadowed by suspicion. Civilians live in quiet terror, knowing that preparation alone cannot prevent disaster. And behind closed doors, empires maneuver, manipulate, and calculate, each waiting for the other to make the first overt move. In a small border town, symbolic of the entire region, a minor incident triggers what will be remembered as the chapter's turning point. A railway bridge, vital for both Russian supply and German logistics, suffers an accidental collapse. No one claims responsibility, yet both sides interpret it as provocation. Reconnaissance units are dispatched. Troops are placed on alert. Orders are whispered through corridors of power, cautious yet deliberate. Mobilize, but do not strike, not yet. The psychological impact is immediate. Civilians panic quietly, sending families into the countryside, stockpiling supplies, and spreading rumors of impending invasion. In Warsaw, Prague, and Riga, people watch columns of soldiers moving along rail lines and across training grounds. The presence of military machines, combined with uncertainty, has created a tension that exceeds any single incident. Europe is holding its collective breath, waiting for the inevitable to unfold. German generals, observing the disruption, see opportunity. The timing is imperfect but promising. They tighten communications, review rapid deployment plans, and ensure that mechanized divisions are ready to advance should the situation deteriorate. Meanwhile, Russian commanders assess the situation with a mixture of caution and confidence, confident that the empire's sheer depth and manpower will absorb initial blows, yet increasingly aware that speed may now favor the opponent. Diplomats, frantic to maintain the facade of control, call for emergency meetings in Geneva, Paris, and London. Messages are sent across capitals, yet clarity is elusive. Every side interprets the other's words as a sign of weakness or deception. Alliances are tested not through declarations but through observation, suspicion, and the subtle tightening of influence. The continent has become a web of power, each strand taut and ready to snap. The chapter closes with a moment suspended in time. Armies poised, spies active, leaders calculating, civilians anxious, all wait. The world is not yet at war, but it is no longer at peace. Every action, every choice, carries weight. One misstep, one misinterpreted order, one act of desperation could transform preparation into destruction. Europe stands on the threshold of conflict, aware of its danger but still unable to turn back. The next chapter will not begin with a whisper, a rumor, or a minor skirmish. It will begin with fire, deliberate, unavoidable, and transformative. For now, the continent watches, waits, and fears the inevitable. The stage is set. The pieces are in motion. And history, patient and relentless, prepares to deliver its verdict.